I've got a book by Anne Lamott, and at some point, I think I read an extract from that book to every student. It's called Bird by Bird. And it talks, or my interpretation of it, it talks about frustration, ultimately. And I think with writing any piece of in-depth work, and a literature review is a very intense piece of in-depth work that's been spent, a lot of time has been spent understanding and trying to piece together, and this is something that has a lot of emotional investment in it as well. And alongside that, that can be very frustrating to write up, and there's this feeling of constant cyclical process of being excited and then frustrated. You suddenly realise something, you say, oh, I see how all of these things link together, and then you try and write it up and you think it's gone again and you can't quite understand it. So it's always up and down as the whole way through the literature review process. And I think being able to cope with that frustration is really important. Being resilient, understanding that when you feel like you don't understand something, that's okay. That's just part of the process. We never understand it. You know, when I read a literature review now by established scholars, I assume they've read some stuff and they've written this first time round. Of course they haven't. Of course they haven't. They've spent ages. They've spent ages in the library. They've spent ages trying to work out how these things work together and trying to figure out how they found and located their own gaps. Everyone goes through it. So for anyone writing a literature review, it's inevitable that we're going to feel frustrated as we go through. So it's being able to accept that, but not just accepting it, but also working through. So I am a firm believer that there isn't any such thing as writer's block. I still will tell myself that I'm going through a process of being in writer's block, but I don't think it really exists. I think it just means I haven't read enough. So when I feel frustrated, when I feel like I can't write, when I'm looking at that Word document and there's nothing on the screen, if it's not coming, if I'm not able to write, it just means that I haven't actually read enough. So I need to spend that day going back to the literature. I need to spend that day going back and understanding how all of these things fit together again. So the book by Anne Lamott, called Bird by Bird, she tells a story of when her brother, it was over the school holidays, and her brother had been set a project on ornithology, and he'd left it to the last day. And she describes it that he was sitting at the table and he's surrounded by books on birds, surrounded by all of these different texts, and just absolutely overwhelmed by this task that's ahead of him. And not understanding how's he possibly going to do this, all of this information, how can he possibly get this into one coherent thing, coherent project? And their dad came downstairs, puts his arm around the boy and says, just take it bird by bird. And I love that story. And I think it applies to literature reviews, I think it applies to almost everything, is that don't look at a literature review when we're at the start of saying, I have to write X thousand words, I have to read however many references. Don't get overwhelmed by that. Just take it step by step. Keep an eye on that. Remember that that's ultimately the objective. But it's making sure that we just take it step by step. And if we work hard enough, and if we accept that frustration, if we keep pushing through, it gets written, and that's how great literature reviews are ultimately written.